The night air above Jerusalem did not carry silence. It carried the scrape of tools on stone, the murmur of men on the walls, and the knowledge that by dawn, thousands would move one step closer to ruin. Beyond the dark ridges, Roman campfires glowed like a second horizon. I'm Steve Turcott, and tonight I want to bring you to one of the great sieges of the ancient world, not at its ending, but at that suspended moment when choice still remained, and every leader believed history might still bend in his favor. Before the walls were broken, before the temple burned, there were men making decisions under pressure so severe that honor, faith, and ambition became almost impossible to separate. Titus stood outside the city with the authority of Rome behind him. Inside, Simon bar Giora and John of Gischala held Jerusalem in a partnership poisoned by distrust. And above them all, though not present at every moment of the siege itself, stood Vespasian, the man whose rise to imperial power shaped everything that followed. To understand why Jerusalem became the center of such violence, we have to go back years earlier, when Roman rule in Judea rested on unstable ground. Rome had intervened in the region long before the siege, first through conquest, then through client kings, and later through governors who often lacked both restraint and legitimacy in the eyes of the people they ruled. Judea was not a passive province. It was politically divided, socially strained, and deeply sensitive to foreign control, especially when that control touched religion, taxation, or local authority. When revolt erupted in the year 66, it did not come from nowhere. It grew out of accumulated grievances, sharpened by Roman misrule and intensified by local factionalism. The governor Florus became, in many accounts, one of the immediate sparks. His actions in Jerusalem, remembered as violent and provocative, helped turn unrest into open rebellion. Roman forces were driven back in humiliating fashion, and what might have been contained as a provincial crisis became a major war. Nero responded by sending one of his most capable commanders, Vespasian. This was not a symbolic appointment. It was a serious military answer to a serious revolt. Vespasian, accompanied by his son Titus, began a methodical campaign. The Romans moved through Galilee and other rebel-held areas with the grim efficiency for which they were known. Fortified places fell one after another. Resistance was punished harshly. Submission was accepted, but rarely without a lesson attached. This is one of the uncomfortable truths of ancient warfare. We often remember commanders by their victories, by arches and statues and triumphs, but victories were built from fear as much as skill. Rome did not simply defeat enemies, it made examples of them. And when I read these campaigns, I'm reminded that the line between discipline and terror can become very thin in the hands of an empire convinced of its own right to rule. Then the wider Roman world collapsed into crisis. Nero died. Civil war followed. In what became known as the Year of the Four Emperors, armies declared their own masters, and the fate of the empire hung on battlefield outcomes far from Judea. Vespasian was drawn into that struggle and eventually emerged as emperor. That changed the war in Judea in a decisive way. Jerusalem would no longer face a provincial expedition, it would face the son of the new emperor, a commander who needed not only to win, but to finish the war in a way worthy of the new dynasty. That commander was Titus. By the spring of the year 70, Titus was advancing on Jerusalem with a force large enough to crush most cities of the Mediterranean world. At the heart of his army stood the Roman legions, hardened professionals of the empire. Around them were auxiliaries, cavalry, and contingents from allied rulers in the region. Ancient sources disagree on exact numbers, as they often do, but the broader picture is clear enough. Titus came with overwhelming strength. Still, numbers alone do not explain the gravity of what he faced. Jerusalem was not merely defended, it was layered, elevated, and set within difficult ground. Valleys protected much of the city naturally. Hills shaped every approach.
The urban defenses had expanded over generations as the population grew, producing multiple lines of walls, especially in the northern sectors where the terrain was less forbidding. The Temple Mount itself formed a vast fortified complex within the city, one that was both sacred center and military stronghold. Inside those defenses stood not one unified army, but several armed factions, and this is where the story becomes deeply human and deeply tragic. Simon bar Giora and John of Gischala were not simply resisting Rome, they were also rivals. Their followers occupied different parts of the city. Their political goals, social bases, and claims to authority did not fit neatly together. At times, they had fought one another as bitterly as they would soon fight the Romans. Simon bar Giora had risen to prominence as a forceful leader with broad support among those drawn to radical resistance. He projected strength, and in a city descending into catastrophe, strength could begin to look a lot like legitimacy. John of Gischala was a different kind of figure, politically agile, ambitious, and already well known from the northern phases of the war. He held key positions connected to the temple area. Between them stood an uneasy arrangement, born not of trust but of necessity. Josephus, our principal narrative source for the siege, gives us much of this picture, though historians read him carefully. He wrote under Roman patronage after the war, and his account is indispensable, but not neutral. That means we can reconstruct the broad outline with confidence, while still recognizing that motives, speeches, and numbers may sometimes be colored by perspective. History often comes to us this way, through voices shaped by survival and proximity to power. And yet, even through those distortions, one truth remains visible. Jerusalem was trying to prepare for a siege while torn by internal struggle. That fact matters as much as the stone walls. A city can be strong in masonry and weak in cohesion. It can have towers, arsenals, and brave men on the parapets, and still be dying from decisions made within. I think this is where the old heroic image of war begins to break apart. The warrior of legend often seems complete in himself, certain of purpose. Real men in history are rarely so simple. Simon and John were determined, resourceful, and dangerous. They were also products of a shattered political world. And Titus, for all his confidence, was marching towards a city whose defenders had already shown they could be unpredictable, courageous, and desperate. As the Roman columns approached by separate routes through the hill country, Jerusalem waited. Pilgrims had swelled the population for Passover. Food stores were under strain. Water was less immediate a problem, thanks to cisterns and reservoirs, but no one could mistake the larger reality. Once the Romans sealed the city, time itself would become a weapon. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling thing about siege warfare. Not the first clash, not the sound of battering rams, not even the sight of towers rising against the walls. It is the moment when everyone inside understands that the enemy does not need to break in right away. He can simply wait and let hunger, fear, and division do part of the work for him. Jerusalem still had walls, it still had fighters, it still had leaders who believed they could resist, but the shadow closing around it was already larger than stone. It was political, it was military, it was psychological. And by the time Titus stood before those battlements, the war had already become something more than a provincial rebellion. It had become a contest over legitimacy, over sacred space, over empire, and over the fate of a city that could no longer retreat. And the siege had only just...
By the spring of the year 70, Titus was marching on Jerusalem with a force large enough to overwhelm almost any city in the eastern Mediterranean. At the center of that army stood the Roman legions, hardened infantry who had spent years turning discipline into a weapon. Around them were auxiliary units, cavalry, and troops sent by allied rulers in the region. Ancient sources give different figures, and as usual, we should be careful with exact numbers, but the broader truth is clear. Titus came to Jerusalem with overwhelming military strength. And yet, if we focus only on numbers, we miss what made this siege so formidable. Jerusalem was not simply a city with walls. It was a city shaped by terrain, by generations of growth, and by a sacred geography that had become inseparable from politics and war. Steep valleys guarded much of it naturally, elevated ridges gave defenders commanding positions, and over time, as the population expanded, new districts had been enclosed behind additional walls, especially on the more exposed northern side. At the center of all this stood the Temple Mount and the Antonia Fortress, dominating the skyline and the logic of the battlefield. The upper city rose on stronger ground to the west, the lower city spread more densely below, and to the north, layers of defensive walls reflected how the city had grown and how its people had tried to keep that growth protected. For an attacking army, this was not one target, it was a series of linked obstacles, each one feeding into the next. Inside those defenses stood roughly 20,000 defenders if we follow the ancient estimates in a broad sense. But these were not 20,000 professional soldiers in the Roman sense. They were a mixture of militia, zealots, refugees, retainers, and factional fighters. Their courage could be real, their determination could be fierce, but their unity was another matter entirely. And this is where Jerusalem becomes not just a military story, but a political tragedy. The city was not defending itself under one uncontested command. It was divided. Simon bar Giora and John of Gischala stood out as the two leading figures, but they were not natural partners. They were rivals forced into coexistence by the pressure of Rome. Simon held major positions in the upper city and along important defensive sectors. John was rooted more deeply around the temple and its surrounding areas. Between them, power was shared only because necessity demanded it. Simon bar Giora was the more visibly martial of the two, a leader whose authority rested heavily on force, charisma, and the support of armed followers who believed resistance had to be total. John of Gischala was more political, more calculating, and in many ways more elusive. He had already shown he could survive shifting circumstances, and now he occupied the most symbolically charged ground in Jerusalem. What matters here is not just that they were different men, it is that they represented different centers of gravity inside a city already under strain. Jerusalem was preparing to face the full force of Rome, while still carrying the scars of internal violence. Factional bloodshed had already weakened trust, damaged supplies, and made coordinated defense harder than it should have been. So when we imagine the defenders on the walls, we have to remember that some of those same men had only recently been looking inward at rival Jews, not outward at Roman camps. That fact changes how we understand the siege. A city can be strong in walls and weak in political cohesion. It can have towers, stores of weapons, determined fighters, and advantageous terrain, and still be vulnerable if its leadership is fractured. Jerusalem was not simply besieged by Rome, it was also burdened by its own divisions. Still, the city was far from helpless. Traditional Jewish fighters were often more lightly equipped than Roman legionaries. They relied on slings, bows, javelins, spears, swords, and clubs. In open battle, that usually put them at a disadvantage against Rome's heavier infantry and cavalry. But siege warfare changes everything. In narrow lanes, on walls, behind barricades, in hidden passages, many of Rome's battlefield advantages were reduced. A disciplined formation is harder to use when streets compress movement, and danger can emerge from rooftops, stairways, or side passages. And Jerusalem's defenders had prepared as best they could. They had gathered arms from workshops, old royal stores, arms dealers, deserters, and earlier victories against Roman forces. They had artillery pieces, they had fortified choke points, they knew the terrain intimately. Underground water systems and passageways could become routes for surprise attacks. In other words, this was not a passive city waiting to be broken, it was a living fortress. I think this is one of the places where history becomes more honest than legend. The defenders were not idealized heroes in shining clarity, and they were not merely doomed fanatics either. They were human beings trying to build a defense out of courage, fear, improvisation, faith, ambition, and desperation. Simon and John were flawed men. Their factions had helped weaken the city, but when the Roman army closed in, those same men still stood at the center of a very real effort to resist overwhelming force. And there was another problem, perhaps the most dangerous of all. In a siege, food and water matter as much as courage. Water was not the immediate crisis. Jerusalem had cisterns, pools, and systems capable of collecting and preserving water, but food was a different matter.
Previous internal struggles had already damaged or destroyed some supplies. The city was crowded even before the siege began. Then, Passover brought in pilgrims, swelling the population still further. So when Titus approached, Jerusalem was not just full of defenders, it was full of civilians, refugees, worshippers, families, and the vulnerable people every siege traps first and saves last. So the real countdown had already started. Once the Romans fully enclosed the city, every day would shrink the defenders' options. Every ration consumed would narrow the future. Every political disagreement would become more dangerous. Every wall that fell would force more people into less space. And that is one of the most chilling features of siege warfare. Time itself becomes a weapon. The attacker does not need to win quickly if hunger, exhaustion, and despair are already marching beside him. Outside the walls, Titus had the army, the engineers, the command structure, and the authority of Rome behind him. Inside, Simon bar Giora and John of Gischala had men willing to fight, but not a city fully healed of its own fractures. They had strong positions, but diminishing room. They had sacred ground, but not infinite supplies. They had reason to hope for resistance, but very little margin for error. I often think this is where the myth of the perfect warrior truly fails. In legend, purpose is simple. In reality, men like Simon
Titus did not arrive before Jerusalem as a reckless attacker, at least not at first. His army had marched hard, and the immediate priority was to secure camps and establish positions outside the city. Roman warfare depended on order. Camps, trenches, embankments, supply lines, and a clear chain of command mattered just as much as swords and shields. But war has a way of punishing even the disciplined when they underestimate the ground or the enemy. Soon after arriving, Titus rode forward to inspect the city more closely. What should have been a reconnaissance nearly became a disaster. The terrain near the walls was broken and cluttered. Gardens, hedges, walls, ditches, uneven stone, all of it making movement awkward and dangerous. Then suddenly, Jewish defenders surged out in force. They struck his mounted party in precisely the kind of terrain that ruins cavalry momentum and breaks formation. For a moment, the son of the emperor-to-be was in real danger. Ancient accounts describe Titus without full battle armor, forced into close combat at very short range. Some of the Roman horsemen in the rear turned and fled. Others became separated by the confusion. And Titus, with only part of his escort around him, had to fight his way clear. Whether every detail was remembered exactly as later writers described it is less important than the broader truth. He had come too close, he had misjudged the danger, and Jerusalem had shown him immediately that prestige would not protect him. This moment matters because it cuts through the polished image of the untouchable general. Commanders in ancient warfare were not abstract minds floating above the battlefield. They were men in dust, noise, confusion, and bad terrain. A horse can stumble, an escort can break, a gate can open at the wrong moment, and history can swing very fast. Titus escaped, but he had been warned. Not long after, as Roman troops worked on positions near the Mount of Olives, the defenders struck again. Emboldened by their success, Jewish fighters poured out in a major sortie aimed at Roman forces still trying to entrench. This was exactly the kind of attack that could become disastrous for an army not yet fully settled into its siege routine. The camp of the 10th Legion, not yet complete, became the focus of a fierce assault. The fighting was chaotic and brutal. Roman soldiers working with tools were suddenly forced to defend themselves in broken ground against determined attackers descending from the city. Men were cut down among half-finished earthworks. Units lost cohesion. Some Romans pulled back uphill in disorder. Again, Titus had to intervene personally, bringing cavalry and bodyguards into the action to prevent the position from collapsing entirely. And even then, the danger was not over. The defenders renewed the pressure. More men streamed from the city. The struggle spread across the slope and ravine. The Romans on lower ground were pushed back again, while Titus and a small group held on long enough for others to regroup. Only after a hard counterattack were the attackers finally forced back, allowing the camp fortifications to be completed. What I find striking here is that siege warfare often begins not with the slow grandeur people imagine, but with exhaustion and improvisation. Men dig with one hand and reach for a shield with the other. Engineers become targets. Commanders are dragged into small crises that threaten to become larger ones.
Before the great machines come forward, there is usually this phase of raw, unstable contact, where no one yet has full control of the field. After these early shocks, Titus adapted. He posted cavalry to guard against further sorties and ordered the ground between the Roman camps and the walls to be cleared. Trees were cut down, hedges were flattened, ditches were filled, rock projections were broken or leveled where possible. This was practical military work, but it also marked a psychological shift. The Romans were no longer merely arriving, they were reshaping the landscape into a siege zone. That matters. A city under siege does not face only the enemy army, it faces the enemy's ability to reorder the land around it. Gardens become open killing ground, ravines become watched approaches, cover disappears. The space between camp and wall becomes an engineered theater of violence. Titus then shifted his main effort towards the western and northern sectors, where the city was more vulnerable to direct assault. The Mount of Olives remained important, but he recognized that the steep eastern approaches were less favorable for a decisive attack, so the Roman line tightened elsewhere. Artillery was brought into position. Earth and timber ramps began to rise towards the third wall. Men worked under missile fire day and night. The rhythm of the siege changed. Now the great machines entered the story. Roman artillery covered the work. Siege ramps crept forward. Battering rams were rolled into place beneath protective sheds. Every day the sounds around Jerusalem changed a little more. Shovels, picks, hammers, shouted orders, creaking timber, wheels grinding over earth, and then the heavy repeated thud of rams striking stone. The defenders responded fiercely. Missiles rained down from the walls. Raiding parties rushed out to attack the engines. Jewish fighters tried repeatedly to burn or break the Roman machines before they could do their work. And this is an important reminder that the siege was not a smooth, unstoppable Roman advance. The defenders were dangerous, inventive, and willing to take serious risks. At one point, they came very close to destroying the rams outright before Titus again intervened with cavalry. The fact that he appears so often at points of crisis should not be dismissed lightly. It tells us something about his style of command. He was aggressive, perhaps sometimes too aggressive, but he did not shrink from direct involvement when the line was in danger. Eventually, however, the weight of Roman engineering began to tell. The ramps reached the wall. The rams went to work, and after sustained pressure, the third wall was finally breached. This was a major moment. The defenders gave ground and withdrew to the second wall, abandoning the outer sector rather than being destroyed in place. Titus pushed forward quickly, wanting to exploit momentum before the city could stabilize its next line of defense. Roman troops entered the new district, and a temporary camp was established amid the captured area. But this did not mean Jerusalem was collapsing, far from it. The second wall became the next flashpoint. Roman forces forced their way in through a breach, only to find the city eerily silent. That silence was a trap. The streets looked deserted, but they were anything but empty. Defenders struck from multiple directions, rooftops, alleys, hidden positions, turning narrow urban space into a killing ground. Roman infantry packed into confined lanes found themselves unable to maneuver properly. Retreat became difficult. The breach itself became a choke point under missile fire. This is where urban warfare destroys military confidence. A breach that looks like victory from outside can become a funnel of death once troops pass through it. Every doorway, every corner, every staircase becomes a possible weapon. Rome's discipline still mattered, but the city itself was now fighting alongside its defenders. The Romans were forced back. Covering fire from archers helped save part of the trapped force, but the message was unmistakable. Even after losing the third wall, Jerusalem was still capable of inflicting sharp reverses. And yet Titus did not let go. He returned to the attack. The fighting around the second wall continued until the Romans broke through again. This time, they held their gains more securely. Titus ordered parts of the captured northern stretch torn down, and Roman troops occupied key towers to prevent the defenders from easily retaking them. So Jerusalem contracted again. The defenders withdrew to the first wall and the temple sector, shrinking the perimeter but also concentrating their remaining strength. This was not simple collapse. In military terms, a smaller line can sometimes be easier to hold, especially for a force that is outnumbered. Simon bar Giora and John of Gischala now faced the Romans on narrower fronts, where they could mass resistance more effectively. By this point, overall command of the defense had passed more clearly to Simon, at least in the broader military sense, while John remained essential around the Temple and Antonia sectors. The city was smaller now, more compressed, more desperate, but perhaps in some ways more dangerous as well. Titus understood that the next phase would be harder. The first wall and the temple complex were not simply more stone to break through, they were the heart of what remained. So he ordered new siege ramps prepared on both eastern and western sectors, including against the approaches to the Antonia fortress. And once again, Roman troops went back to labor under constant fire. That is one of the defining patterns of this siege: setback, adjustment, renewed labor, sortie, counterattack, rebuilding. Titus kept pushing. The defenders kept resisting. Neither side had the luxury of stopping. And with each new line of siege works, the struggle moved closer to the sacred and political center of Jerusalem, towards the place where military defeat would become something even more devastating than the loss of walls. Because by now, this was no longer just a siege of a city. It was becoming a siege of its final meaning.
The Roman assault now pressed hard against Jerusalem's remaining defenses. Siege ramps crept forward again. Artillery hammered the walls. Battering rams struck stone in a rhythm that must have become part of the city's daily life, beneath the shouting, the prayers, and the cries of the wounded. This was no longer the uncertain opening of the siege. It was a grinding contest of pressure, labor, and attrition. But the defenders were far from passive. They answered Roman engineering with missiles, raids, and brutal close fighting. Every ramp that rose toward the walls had to survive stones, arrows, slingshots, and sudden attacks on foot. This is one of the things I always come back to in ancient sieges. Rome had organization, manpower, and technical skill, but a determined defense could still undo days of work in a single burst of fire and courage. Eventually, the Romans forced a breach in the second wall. The defenders gave ground and fell back again, deeper into the city. Titus pressed quickly, trying to keep momentum on his side. He wanted to exploit success before Jerusalem could fully rebuild its defenses. Roman troops pushed into the newly taken areas, and for a moment it seemed the siege might be accelerating toward a decisive break. Then the city itself turned against them. Roman soldiers entering through narrow breaches found themselves in constricted streets, uncertain lines of sight, and a maze of close stone spaces that favored the defenders. Jerusalem had become something more dangerous than a wall. It had become an urban battlefield. Missiles came from above, attacks struck from side lanes. Withdrawal became difficult. A breach that had looked like an opening now threatened to become a trap. This is the reality of siege warfare that maps do not always capture. Once an army enters a defended city, walls stop being the only problem. Every alley, rooftop, stairway, and doorway becomes part of the defense. The city fights alongside the people inside it. Still, Rome adapted. The second wall was eventually secured again, and Titus ordered parts of it torn down so the defenders could not simply reoccupy what had been lost. That was standard Roman practice, practical, cold, and effective. They did not merely take space, they altered it so it could not easily be used against them again. Now the defenders withdrew to the first wall and the temple complex. This was no random retreat. In military terms, the shrinking perimeter could actually help them. A smaller defensive line meant that fewer men were needed to hold it. It also meant they could mass what strength remained in more concentrated positions. Simon bar Giora and John of Gischala, for all their rivalry, now stood behind stronger and more symbolically powerful ground than before. At this stage, the war moved toward the Antonia fortress and the temple front. Titus understood the importance of Antonia. If the Romans could break through there, they would gain access to the northern side of the temple complex, and with that, leverage over the heart of Jerusalem. The defenders understood it too. Every stone in that sector now mattered far beyond its physical size. So, the Romans raised fresh ramps. Rams and towers were brought up again, and once more, the defenders answered not only with courage, but with ingenuity. This is where one of the most dramatic reversals of the siege took place.
While Roman attention fixed on the visible struggle above ground, Jewish defenders had been digging below it. They tunneled beneath the Roman approach works near the Antonia sector. They propped the underground chambers with timber. Then they set those supports alight. As the fire consumed the beams, the ground above gave way. Suddenly, Roman ramps and siege engines collapsed into a great chasm. It is a remarkable image, days of labor, carefully built under missile fire, vanishing in moments beneath the army that trusted them. And the destruction did not stop there. Fire spread through the fallen works, helped along with flammable material, and what the collapse had not ruined, flame began to consume. The Romans had once again underestimated the defenders. At the same time, on the western front, Simon Bar Giora launched his own counterstroke. Under cover of darkness, his fighters sallied out against the Roman siege works there as well. They fought through resistance, reached the equipment, and set the protective sheds ablaze. Roman troops rushed in to save the battering rams, trying to drag them out before the fire consumed them. But the fighting turned into a deadly struggle at very close quarters, a desperate tug of war over machines that represented days of labor and the hopes of the assault. The defenders won. By dawn, Roman ramps and rams in both sectors had been destroyed or left burning. The legionaries, who had already endured heat, thirst, labor, and repeated combat, now had to face the sight of their work reduced to smoking wreckage. Morale must have suffered badly. The siege, which Rome had tried to reduce to a machine of pressure and certainty, had become unstable again. And then came something even more dangerous for the Romans. The defenders sensed opportunity. Jewish fighters pushed out in pursuit, driving Roman troops all the way back toward their camps. This was not just a local success anymore. It was the kind of moment that can reverse confidence. A besieged army wants to believe the city is shrinking before it. Now, suddenly, the city seemed to be lashing outward with fresh energy. Once again, Titus had to intervene personally, bringing cavalry into the fight to stabilize the retreat. The defenders were finally pushed back toward the first wall. The Roman position held, but only just. By morning, the siege lines were in shambles, and the men who had come to destroy Jerusalem had been reminded that they could still be bloodied, checked, and humiliated. This is where we see something essential about siege warfare. Morale is never just a matter of speeches. It is built from labor, rhythm, confidence, and the belief that suffering leads somewhere. When siege works burn, that confidence burns with them. Summer was closing in now. Heat bore down on the camps. Water was harder to come by. Timber and usable materials were becoming scarce. The Romans had to find a way not only to continue the siege, but to restore the spirit of the army. Titus responded with a new plan, one more ambitious than another ramp, and in some ways more decisive than any direct assault so far. He ordered the construction of a circumvallation wall around Jerusalem. This was a major turning point. Instead of trying only to break in, Titus would now make sure no one could get out. A ring of walls, ditches, and fortified points would close around the city and seal it off from the countryside. Escape routes would vanish. Foraging would end. Hope of slipping through the Roman line for supplies would be cut away. And Titus seems to understand something about soldiers as well as siegecraft. To rebuild morale, he used the competitive pride of the army itself. Legions and cohorts were set against one another in labor, each striving to complete its assigned section first. The work became a challenge.
The destruction of the Roman siege works was not just a tactical setback. It struck at something deeper, morale. Men who had spent days laboring in heat, dust, and constant danger had watched their work vanish in fire and collapse. And ancient armies did not run on obedience alone. They ran on confidence. A soldier had to believe that suffering meant progress, that his commanders could turn effort into victory. Once that belief began to crack, the danger spread faster than any flame. Titus understood that, and instead of responding only with punishment or anger, he answered with a project even larger than the one that had failed. He ordered the construction of a wall of circumvallation around Jerusalem. This was one of the decisive acts of the entire siege. It was practical, symbolic, and psychological all at once. The city would now be enclosed. Movement in and out would become nearly impossible. Escape, foraging, communication with the countryside, all of it would be choked off. Jerusalem would no longer be facing a series of assaults. It would be facing a tightening ring of calculated pressure. Ancient sources emphasize how quickly the Romans completed this work, and while exact details are always open to discussion, the broad fact itself is not in doubt. The encircling system was built with astonishing speed. That speed matters because it tells us something essential about Rome. Even after setbacks, even after embarrassment and loss, the Roman army could still turn discipline and labor into a weapon on a massive scale. And there was another layer to it. Titus seems to have used the competitive pride of the troops themselves, setting units against one another in a kind of race to complete their assigned sections. That may sound like a small detail, but it reveals a great deal about command. He was not only building a wall, he was rebuilding the army's confidence in itself. The result was a success. Roman morale recovered, the siege lines hardened, and for the people inside Jerusalem, the message was unmistakable. Rome was not backing away. In fact, Rome had just turned the siege into something colder and more methodical. With the circumvallation complete, the city was finally sealed. Before that, some people had still managed to slip out at night and gather supplies from the surrounding countryside. Now those chances disappeared. The open ground beyond the walls was under Roman control. Patrols watched movement, the noose had tightened. And this is where the story turns even darker. Any rebels caught outside the walls could expect brutal punishment. Ancient sources describe crucifixions carried out as a warning to all who still hoped to resist or escape. Defectors who came out willingly were not necessarily safe either. Roman suspicion, fear of hidden valuables, and the cruelty that often follows prolonged siege warfare meant that even surrender could lead to horror. Inside Jerusalem, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Food had already been a problem. Now it became the central fact of life. Supplies had been damaged earlier in the conflict. The city was overcrowded with pilgrims and refugees. The defenders themselves were only part of the population. The larger burden fell on civilians. Once the exits were truly closed, famine stopped being a fear of the future and became the defining condition of the present. Ancient accounts describe the city sliding into extremes of starvation. People ate things they would never have imagined touching before the siege. Pets disappeared. Hay was boiled. Stories emerged so disturbing that even historians approach them with caution. Not because starvation is doubtful, but because extreme suffering often comes to us through language shaped by shock and rhetoric. Even so, the broader truth is beyond question. Jerusalem was starving. And this is the point where any romantic image of defense has to give way to something more honest. Courage under starvation does not disappear, but it changes. It becomes harsher, less polished, more desperate. Men who once spoke of glory begin thinking in smaller, crueler units of time. One more day, one more ration, one more section of wall held. War reaches into the body first, and from there into the mind. Still, Simon bar Giora and John of Gischala did not surrender. That decision is not simple to judge. From a distance, it is easy to ask why leaders continue resistance when victory has become almost impossible. But in ancient siege warfare, surrender did not necessarily mean mercy. It could mean execution, enslavement, humiliation, and the destruction of everything a city believed sacred. For men like Simon and John, continuing the defense may have seemed terrible, but still less terrible than the alternatives. And we should remember something else. Their control inside Jerusalem was real, but it was never absolute. They led armed factions in a city already broken by internal conflict. They were not operating in calm political conditions where rational compromise could simply be chosen and enforced. By this stage, fear, pride, exhaustion, faith, and vengeance all pushed against any clean act of surrender. Outside the walls, Titus was becoming something more than a battlefield commander. He was now acting as the visible instrument of Flavian legitimacy. His father, Vespasian, had emerged from civil war as emperor. The new dynasty needed not just victory, but a victory that could be displayed, narrated, and used. Jerusalem had become part of that larger story. This is one of the reasons the siege grew so relentless. It was no longer simply a local military operation. It had become part of Rome's own effort to define itself after internal chaos. A father had begun the campaign. A son would finish it. And the fall of Jerusalem would stand as proof that order had returned under Flavian rule. That political context matters because it helps explain why there was so little room for retreat or compromise on the Roman side. Titus did not merely need progress. He needed closure. The city had to fall in a way that confirmed Roman power, imperial stability, and dynastic authority. And so the siege moved toward its next and perhaps most symbolically charged phase, the concentrated assault on the Antonia fortress and the approaches to the temple. By this point, the Romans understood the military logic very clearly. If they could take Antonia and control the northern approaches, they could threaten the temple directly. The defenders understood it just as clearly. The struggle was now moving into the sacred heart of Jerusalem. What I find so striking here is the contrast between material and meaning. For the Romans, Antonia was a tactical objective, a fortress to be reduced, an approach to be opened. For the defenders, that same front was inseparable from the temple, from identity, and from the spiritual center of the city. The closer the Romans moved, the more military necessity and religious meaning fused into one battlefield. Inside Jerusalem, hunger deepened. Outside, Roman confidence returned with the wall they had built. Between the two stood leaders still making choices under impossible pressure. Vespasian, though no longer on the scene in person, remained central to all of it. He had shaped the campaign from the beginning. He had risen to the imperial throne through a wider crisis. And now the final outcome would reflect back on him as surely as it would on Titus. Father and son were bound together by conquest, by ambition, and by the political necessity of finishing what had been begun. I think this is where the siege of Jerusalem becomes more than a military story. It becomes a study in how war, politics, and survival lock together until they leave very little room for mercy. The Romans had learned from their setbacks and answered with structure, labor, and containment. The defenders had answered with endurance, ingenuity, and refusal, but the city itself could not escape the arithmetic of famine. And once a city begins to starve, every wall becomes weaker, even if no stone has yet fallen. Jerusalem still held, Simon and John still resisted, Titus still prepared the next assault. But by now the war had entered a different register. The battlefield was no longer only the wall line or the breach point. It was also the empty storehouse, the guarded gate, the frightened household, the starving courtyard. The ring around the city had done what battering rams alone could not. It had turned time into a Roman ally. And from here, the struggle would move ever closer to the temple itself, toward the place where military victory and spiritual catastrophe would become one and the same.
Titus did not arrive before Jerusalem as a reckless attacker, at least not at first. His army had marched hard, and the immediate priority was to secure camps and establish positions outside the city. Roman warfare depended on order. Camps, trenches, embankments, supply lines, and the clear chain of command mattered just as much as swords and shields. But war has a way of punishing even the disciplined when they underestimate the ground or the enemy. Soon after arriving, Titus rode forward to inspect the city more closely. What should have been a reconnaissance nearly became a disaster. The terrain near the walls was broken and cluttered. Gardens, hedges, walls, ditches, uneven stone, all of it making movement awkward and dangerous. Then suddenly, Jewish defenders surged out in force. They struck his mounted party in precisely the kind of terrain that ruins cavalry momentum and breaks formation. For a moment, the son of the emperor-to-be was in real danger. Ancient accounts describe Titus without full battle armor, forced into close combat at very short range. Some of the Roman horsemen in the rear turned and fled. Others became separated by the confusion, and Titus, with only part of his escort around him, had to fight his way clear. Whether every detail was remembered exactly as later writers described it is less important than the broader truth. He had come too close, he had misjudged the danger, and Jerusalem had shown him immediately that prestige would not protect him. This moment matters because it cuts through the polished image of the untouchable general. Commanders in ancient warfare were not abstract minds floating above the battlefield. They were men in dust, noise, confusion, and bad terrain. A horse can stumble, an escort can break, a gate can open at the wrong moment, and history can swing very fast. Titus escaped, but he had been warned. Not long after, as Roman troops worked on positions near the Mount of Olives, the defenders struck again. Emboldened by their success, Jewish fighters poured out in a major sortie aimed at Roman forces still trying to entrench. This was exactly the kind of attack that could become disastrous for an army not yet fully settled into its siege routine. The camp of the 10th Legion, not yet complete, became the focus of a fierce assault. The fighting was chaotic and brutal. Roman soldiers working with tools were suddenly forced to defend themselves in broken ground against determined attackers descending from the city. Men were cut down among half-finished earthworks. Units lost cohesion. Some Romans pulled back uphill in disorder. Again, Titus had to intervene personally, bringing cavalry and bodyguards into the action to prevent the position from collapsing entirely. And even then, the danger was not over. The defenders renewed the pressure. More men streamed from the city. The struggle spread across the slope and ravine.
The Romans on lower ground were pushed back again, while Titus and a small group held on long enough for others to regroup. Only after a hard counterattack were the attackers finally forced back, allowing the camp fortifications to be completed. What I find striking here is that siege warfare often begins not with the slow grandeur people imagine, but with exhaustion and improvisation. Men dig with one hand and reach for a shield with the other. Engineers become targets. Commanders are dragged into small crises that threaten to become larger ones. Before the great machines come forward, there is usually this phase of raw, unstable contact, where no one yet has full control of the field. After these early shocks, Titus adapted. He posted cavalry to guard against further sorties and ordered the ground between the Roman camps and the walls to be cleared. Trees were cut down, hedges were flattened, ditches were filled, rock projections were broken or leveled where possible. This was practical military work, but it also marked a psychological shift. The Romans were no longer merely arriving, they were reshaping the landscape into a siege zone. That matters. A city under siege does not face only the enemy army, it faces the enemy's ability to reorder the land around it. Gardens become open killing ground, ravines become watched approaches, cover disappears. The space between camp and wall becomes an engineered theater of violence. Titus then shifted his main effort towards the western and northern sectors, where the city was more vulnerable to direct assault. The Mount of Olives remained important, but he recognized that the steep eastern approaches were less favorable for a decisive attack, so the Roman line tightened elsewhere. Artillery was brought into position. Earth and timber ramps began to rise towards the third wall. Men worked under missile fire day and night. The rhythm of the siege changed. Now the great machines entered the story. Roman artillery covered the work. Siege ramps crept forward. Battering rams were rolled into place beneath protective sheds. Every day the sounds around Jerusalem changed a little more. Shovels, picks, hammers, shouted orders, creaking timber, wheels grinding over earth, and then the heavy repeated thud of rams striking stone. The defenders responded fiercely. Missiles rained down from the walls. Raiding parties rushed out to attack the engines. Jewish fighters tried repeatedly to burn or break the Roman machines before they could do their work. And this is an important reminder that the siege was not a smooth, unstoppable Roman advance. The defenders were dangerous, inventive, and willing to take serious risks. At one point, they came very close to destroying the rams outright before Titus again intervened with cavalry. The fact that he appears so often at points of crisis should not be dismissed lightly. It tells us something about his style of command. He was aggressive, perhaps sometimes too aggressive, but he did not shrink from direct involvement when the line was in danger. Eventually, however, the weight of Roman engineering began to tell. The ramps reached the wall. The rams went to work. And after sustained pressure, the third wall was finally breached. This was a major moment. The defenders gave ground and withdrew to the second wall, abandoning the outer sector rather than being destroyed in place. Titus pushed forward quickly, wanting to exploit momentum before the city could stabilize its next line of defense. Roman troops entered the new district, and a temporary camp was established amid the captured area. But this did not mean Jerusalem was collapsing, far from it. The second wall became the next flashpoint. Roman forces forced their way in through a breach, only to find the city eerily silent. That silence was a trap. The streets looked deserted, but they were anything but empty. Defenders struck from multiple directions, rooftops, alleys, hidden positions, turning narrow urban space into a killing ground. Roman infantry packed into confined lanes found themselves unable to maneuver properly. Retreat became difficult. The breach itself became a choke point under missile fire. This is where urban warfare destroys military confidence. A breach that looks like victory from outside can become a funnel of death once troops pass through it. Every doorway, every corner, every staircase becomes a possible weapon. Rome's discipline still mattered, but the city itself was now fighting alongside its defenders. The Romans were forced back. Covering fire from archers helped save part of the trapped force, but the message was unmistakable. Even after losing the third wall, Jerusalem was still capable of inflicting sharp reverses. And yet Titus did not let go. He returned to the attack. The fighting around the second wall continued until the Romans broke through again. This time, they held their gains more securely. Titus ordered parts of the captured northern stretch torn down, and Roman troops occupied key towers to prevent the defenders from easily retaking them. So Jerusalem contracted again. The defenders withdrew to the first wall and the temple sector, shrinking the perimeter but also concentrating their remaining strength. This was not simple collapse. In military terms, a smaller line can sometimes be easier to hold, especially for a force that is outnumbered. Simon bar Giora and John of Gischala now faced the Romans on narrower fronts, where they could mass resistance more effectively. By this point, overall command of the defense had passed more clearly to Simon, at least in the broader military sense, while John remained essential around the Temple and Antonia sectors. The city was smaller now, more compressed, more desperate, but perhaps in some ways more dangerous as well. Titus understood that the next phase would be harder. The first wall and the temple complex were not simply more stone to break through, they were the heart of what remained. So he ordered new siege ramps prepared on both eastern and western sectors, including against the approaches to the Antonia fortress. And once again, Roman troops went back to labor under constant fire. That is one of the defining patterns of this siege. Setback, adjustment, renewed labor. Sortie, counterattack, rebuilding. Titus kept pushing. The defenders kept resisting. Neither side had the luxury of stopping. And with each new line of siege works, the struggle moved closer to the sacred and political center of Jerusalem, towards the place where military defeat would become something even more devastating than the loss of walls. Because by now, this was no longer just a siege of a city. It was becoming a siege of its final meaning.
By late July and early August, the siege had narrowed to the Temple Mount itself. The Romans had peeled away outer defenses, widened their approaches, and forced the defenders into ground that was not only militarily vital, but spiritually central. The temple complex was no ordinary stronghold. It was a vast fortified platform of courts, gates, walls, and colonnades. To the Romans, it had become a military objective that had to be reduced. To the defenders, it was inseparable from identity, worship, and the very meaning of Jerusalem. That collision of meanings changed everything. The Romans had learned that narrow bottlenecks favored the defenders, so they worked to open more space, tearing down northern structures and broadening the front from which they could attack. The defenders responded by reorganizing around the remaining sacred architecture. The temple itself became the center of a shrinking line. Simon bar Giora still held positions toward the upper city, but John of Gischala remained crucial around the temple front. Their rivalry had not vanished. But by now, war and survival were pressing so hard that lesser ambitions had been burned down to the essentials. And then came one of the most significant spiritual blows of the siege. Ancient sources tell us that the regular daily sacrifice in the temple ceased for lack of animals. Historians generally accept this as a profound moment. It is one thing to lose streets and walls. It is another to watch the rhythm of sacred life break under military pressure. For many inside Jerusalem, that must have felt like a wound deeper than stone breached by a ram. The siege was no longer only taking ground. It was interrupting the order of the world as they understood it. I think this matters because warfare is never just about bodies and buildings. It reaches into symbols, rituals, and the habits by which people make sense of suffering. When those break, something inside a city breaks with them. Titus pressed on. Roman troops burned out and tore down the northern colonnade, opening broader access onto the temple platform. That gave the Romans something they had lacked before: space. And space mattered enormously. The Roman army was built to function in disciplined, ordered bodies. Constricted lanes and choke points had repeatedly turned Roman strength into frustration. Open paving under the summer sun offered the possibility of using the legions more as they were meant to fight. The defenders understood the danger and reformed their line across the center of the Temple Mount. The left rested toward the western side, with routes back toward the upper city. The right leaned on the eastern structures. The center ran through the temple and its inner courts. This was not just a final line of defense. It was a final act of concentration, military, emotional, and sacred all at once. At the center of this world stood the inner temple itself. Surrounded by walls, courts, and colonnades, it rose in white stone and gold, a place of immense religious meaning. Under normal conditions, much of it was inaccessible to ordinary fighters. But nothing about this moment was normal. Extraordinary circumstances had forced defenders into places where war and holiness now stood face to face. Then, at dawn on the 9th of August, the defenders struck first. Though exhausted and starving, Jewish fighters burst from the temple sector and attacked the Roman lines. This was a remarkable thing in itself. It would have been easy to imagine them waiting passively behind sacred walls. Instead, they chose violence on the offensive. The clash that followed became the third major battle for the temple. The fighting centered on the eastern part of the sanctuary. Defenders fought in the courts while others on nearby rooftops provided supporting fire. Roman missile troops answered from the rear. Titus reportedly used cavalry where the open spaces still allowed it, but even here the terrain imposed limits. This was not a battlefield suited to sweeping maneuvers. It was a place where every movement had to negotiate sacred architecture, walls, and crowded stone ground. The battle raged for hours. Neither side broke the other cleanly. The day settled into an uneasy stalemate. Then the next morning, the fighting resumed. On the 10th of August, the defenders attacked again. The fourth battle of the temple began in much the same way, hard fought, close, confused, and relentlessly costly. Roman troops counterattacked and gradually drove the defenders back toward the temple walls themselves. Jews above the walls rolled stones and hurled projectiles downward onto the packed Roman mass below. And then, in the chaos of that moment, something happened that changed the course of the siege forever. A Roman soldier seized a piece of burning material. Another lifted him high enough to reach the low golden opening on the north side of the temple structures. The burning debris was thrown inside. Now, here we should be careful. Ancient sources, especially Josephus, present Titus as wanting to preserve the temple, with the fire beginning through the impulsive act of a soldier in the confusion. Some historians find that plausible, others are more cautious. Once discipline breaks in a siege, and once troops begin surging into a rich and symbolically charged objective, control becomes very difficult. Whether Titus truly intended preservation or whether events had simply moved beyond command is still debated. What seems clear is this: once the fire took hold, everything changed. The chambers of the temple were vulnerable to flame. In the dry summer heat, timber and textiles caught quickly. Thick black smoke began to billow into the sky. Both sides understood the horror of what was happening. For the defenders, the temple was not just a strongpoint. It was the sacred center of their world. For the Romans, it was now a burning objective, full of symbolic and material value. The defenders froze between two impossible demands: save the temple, or fight the Romans pressing in. The Romans seized the moment. Without waiting for neat command, soldiers surged forward. The eastern gates were battered down. Roman troops poured into the inner court. And here we reach one of the darkest truths of siege warfare. At the climax of a long siege, when men have endured months of labor, rage, frustration, and fear, discipline can give way to something much more primitive. Soldiers stop acting as instruments of command and begin acting out of accumulated fury and greed. That is what seems to have happened here. The inner court became a place of massacre. Those who did not flee were cut down. The old, the young, the helpless, none was spared by the momentum of the assault. At the same time, Roman soldiers rushed into the burning complex seeking treasure. Looting and killing unfolded side by side. Some men were trampled by their own comrades in the frenzy. Even Titus's presence could do little to restrain what had been unleashed. I think this is one of the moments where the language of victory starts to feel morally thin. Rome had won access to the heart of Jerusalem. Yes, but in doing so, it had entered the most sacred space of the city in a storm of fire, blood, and plunder. There are triumphs so complete that they reveal the poverty of triumph itself. Eventually the frenzy subsided, not because mercy returned, but because there was less left to seize. The temple had been picked clean as it burned. What remained was flame, ruin, and the full realization that the sacred center of Jewish Jerusalem was gone. Afterward, Titus performed Roman religious rites at the eastern gate. This too mattered symbolically. The conquest was not being treated only as a military success, but as a demonstration of divine favor and imperial domination. Rome had not merely entered the Temple Mount. It had claimed the meaning of the place through victory. And yet, even then, the war was not fully over. The Temple Mount had fallen, but Jewish resistance in the rest of Jerusalem had not yet disappeared. Simon bar Giora still held the upper city. Others who had escaped the flames regrouped around surviving fortified positions. The siege had crossed a terrible threshold, but the final chapter still remained. What stayed behind on the Temple Mount was more than wreckage. It was a civilizational wound. The sacred routines had ended. The courts were blackened. The sanctuary had burned. Defenders who had fought among altars and colonnades now had to look back at smoke rising from the place they had tried to preserve. Roman troops, meanwhile, stood inside a victory that had become inseparable from destruction. This is why the fall of the temple remained so powerful in memory. Not simply because a building was lost, but because the battle there brought together all the harshest elements of the siege: faith, empire, desperation, rage, hunger, symbolism, and the final collapse of restraint. And perhaps that is the truest way to understand this stage of the siege. Not as a clean military breakthrough, but as the moment when the struggle for Jerusalem ceased to be only about walls and became instead a catastrophe at the very center of meaning. The city still had one final pocket of resistance, but after the temple burned, Jerusalem was no longer fighting merely to survive. It was fighting in the shadow of something already lost forever. The fall of the temple did not end the siege. It changed it. Jerusalem's sacred and defensive center had been broken, but resistance still survived beyond the smoke. Simon bar Giora and John of Gischala, or what remained of their authority, still had men in the upper city and in the strong fortifications around Herod's palace on the western heights. Across the Tyropon Valley, they now faced the Romans from the last major stronghold still in Jewish hands. This final position was formidable. Herod's palace was not just a residence. It was a fortress, protected by strong walls and great towers. The upper city itself stood on better ground, and the urban approach toward it was difficult. Underground passages still offered possibilities for movement and surprise. The defenders had lost the temple, but they had not yet lost every means of resistance. There was a brief moment when the war might have paused. A parley was attempted. The defenders sought terms. Simon and John, facing a city already maimed beyond repair, tried to secure safe passage out of Jerusalem. But Titus had no reason now to bargain softly. The temple had fallen, the Romans held the initiative completely, and so he demanded unconditional surrender. That answer tells us a great deal about the stage the war had reached. This was no longer a contest with room for compromise. Rome had paid heavily for Jerusalem. The city had resisted too long, inflicted too much, and forced too many reverses for Titus to settle for anything less than total submission. When the negotiations failed, the Romans moved to make their answer unmistakable. They unleashed violence on the lower city. For 2 days, Roman troops pushed through alleys, rooftops, and ruined districts, cutting down fighters and civilians alike. Fires were set, resistance was hunted street by street. Urban warfare, already savage earlier in the siege, now became even more pitiless because it was no longer merely about taking ground. It was also about demonstration. Rome was showing what refusal meant. This is one of the bleakest parts of the story. Once a city has lost its sacred center and its defenders retreat into a final redoubt, the districts left between often become sacrificial space. They are burned, cleared, crushed, not always because every street matters strategically, but because destruction itself becomes part of the siege's final language. Ancient accounts describe dead left unburied, smoke thickening over the streets, and a stench rising from the lower city as fire and decay mixed together. That fits what we know from many sieges across history. Once civic order collapses under assault, the city stops functioning as a city. It becomes terrain filled with rubble, fear, corpses, and heat. And still the upper city held. This last stronghold, centered around Herod's palace and the western heights, posed serious problems even for a victorious Roman army. The palace complex had substantial walls and a ring of towers of extraordinary height. Buildings in the upper city complicated the line of approach. Hidden passages beneath the ground might still allow defenders to strike unexpectedly. And by this point, the Romans had already learned the cost of underestimating a fortified urban defense. So Titus did not simply throw men at the strongest surviving position from the front. He chose a broader and more practical solution. The final assault would come from the west, outside the main interior congestion of the city, where all 4 legions could be brought together and new ramps raised against the upper city and palace defenses. Roman engineering returned to the center of the story. All 4 legions were massed in the Hinnom Valley, and new siege works began to rise. At the same time, auxiliary and allied troops already inside parts of Jerusalem set to work on their own platforms against key upper city positions. This was the Roman method at full scale: pressure from outside, pressure from inside. Labor turned once again into a weapon. But by now even Rome was feeling the strain. Resources were thin, timber and manpower were no longer abundant. The men had endured months of heat, fatigue, combat, and grisly labor. Construction moved more slowly than before. Still, the siege works were completed over roughly 2.5 weeks. That fact matters. Even at the end, even after all the bloodshed and destruction already behind them, the Romans did not gain their final victory by simple momentum. They still had to work for it. Inside the upper city, the defenders were in an even worse condition. Hunger had done what direct assault alone could not. The fighters who remained were weakened, exhausted, and pressed into the smallest surviving pocket of resistance. Sorties, once fierce and frequent, now dwindled. Defenders still held the walls, but they no longer struck outward with the same force. This does not mean courage had vanished. It means the body has limits, and no cause, however sacred or desperate, can erase them forever. I think this is the point where the myth of the invincible warrior fully collapses. In legend, endurance seems infinite if the cause is righteous enough. In real siege warfare, men starve, grow sick, lose sleep, lose friends, and lose judgment. Their courage may survive, but it survives inside failing flesh. There is something harsher and more honest in that than in any polished story of glorious last stands. By the 7th of September, the Roman works were ready. Battering resumed, the walls of the final stronghold began to give way, and for the first time, the defenders did not come out in proper force to strike at the siege engines. That silence was itself a sign that the end had arrived. The Romans breached the western wall. Legionaries entered, but what followed was not some dramatic last heroic stand in which every tower had to be taken by storm. Ancient accounts suggest something more tragic and more believable. Once Roman troops began seizing the battlements, the psychological collapse spread faster than swords could. The truth of final defeat moved through the defenders more quickly than any physical assault. The great towers, Hippicus, Phasael, Mariam, were abandoned. Survivors broke in different directions. Some tried to flee through streets. Some disappeared into hidden passages. Some crawled through sewers. Others attempted to dig their way out. What remained of organized resistance dissolved into individual attempts at survival. And this, too, is important. Cities do not always end in one perfect final tableau of defiance. Often they end in fragmentation. One man runs, another hides, another surrenders, another keeps fighting for reasons even he may no longer understand. History likes symmetry. Real collapse rarely gives it to us. Simon bar Giora and John of Gischala each tried in different ways to escape the city's end. Neither succeeded. Both were captured alive. Their survival was not an act of mercy. In Roman political culture, a defeated leader could be more valuable alive than dead, at least for a time. A conquered enemy displayed in a triumph could serve imperial propaganda longer than a body left in the rubble. So Simon and John, once the dominant figures in Jerusalem's defense, were taken into Roman custody and preserved for what came next. The rest of the population faced a harsher, more anonymous fate. Young men could be selected for display in Rome or for forced labor. Others were sent to mines or arenas. Women and children were sold into slavery. Ancient casualty figures are notoriously unreliable. Josephus gives an enormous number, and Tacitus another, but whether or not the exact totals are trusted, the scale of suffering is beyond serious doubt. Jerusalem had been overcrowded, trapped, starved, assaulted, burned, and finally sacked. The destruction was immense. What followed the fall was the old Roman grammar of domination. Prisoners sorted, spoils gathered, the city stripped and broken, sacred objects carried away, surviving leaders set aside for display. The war had begun as a revolt in a troubled province. It ended as imperial spectacle waiting to happen. When I think about this final stage, I always come back to the same uneasy truth. Victory and ruin are often more closely related than the language of conquest wants to admit. Titus had won, Rome had triumphed, but the city lying behind that triumph was a wasteland. Simon and John had resisted, but the Jerusalem they were trying to save no longer existed in any form they would have recognized. And that is why the fall of the upper city matters so much. It was not just the last military act of the siege. It was the moment when the remaining illusions disappeared. The temple was gone, the lower city was ravaged, the final fortress had fallen, the leaders were prisoners, the people were captives or dead. Jerusalem had not been taken in one clean blow. It had been reduced in stages, wall by wall, district by district, symbol by symbol, until there was almost nothing left but smoke, stone, and memory. And from that ruin, Rome would now build a story of glory. What followed the military victory at Jerusalem was the old Roman grammar of domination. Once the city had fallen, the empire moved quickly to turn defeat into order, spectacle, and profit. Prisoners were sorted, captives were separated by age, sex, and perceived usefulness. Young men judged fit for display might be reserved for a triumph. Others were sent to forced labor or death. Women and children were absorbed into the slave markets. The machinery of conquest began to work with the same efficiency that had built the siege itself. We do not know exactly how many people died in the destruction of Jerusalem. Ancient writers give enormous figures, and historians rightly treat them with caution. Josephus gives one of the most famous numbers. Tacitus offers another. Both may exaggerate in different ways, but uncertainty about exact totals should never become doubt about the scale of suffering. Jerusalem had been crowded with residents, pilgrims, and refugees. Then it was trapped, starved, assaulted, burned, and sacked. However we measure it, the human loss was vast. And the city itself was left shattered. The temple was gone, entire districts had burned, fortifications that once promised safety now stood broken or empty. What had been the sacred center of Jewish Jerusalem became a landscape of ash and conquest. For Jewish history, that loss would echo for centuries. For Rome, it became something else entirely, a monument to imperial power. And this is where Vespasian comes back sharply into view. The victory in Jerusalem belonged in part to Titus on the battlefield. But it also belonged to the regime his father had created. The Flavian dynasty had emerged from Roman civil war and needed legitimacy. Jerusalem provided it in dramatic form. The conquest could now be used as proof that order had been restored under Vespasian and would continue under his house. In other words, the fall of the city was not only a military result, it was political capital. That is one of the reasons Roman triumphs matter so much. A triumph was never just a celebration. It was a statement. It told the people of Rome what had happened, who had the favor of the gods, and who deserved to rule. It transformed distant suffering into visible imperial confidence. Back in Rome, preparations began for that display. The return of Titus was staged with care. The victory at Jerusalem was worthy of a triumph. And not just any triumph. It would help anchor the prestige of the new dynasty. When the day came, Titus would ride in ceremonial splendor through the streets of Rome, and the empire would watch its own power made visible. Soldiers marched in full regalia. Captives were led in chains. Floats and display platforms recreated scenes from the war in the East. And there is something deeply revealing in that transformation. Events that, in Jerusalem, had meant smoke, blood, hunger, and terror were now remade as urban theater in the capital. The empire consumed the suffering of the frontier and turned it into pageantry. The spoils of Jerusalem were carried through the city as symbols of conquest. Among them, the great seven-branched menorah stood out above all. Removed from its sacred setting and paraded through Rome, it became one of the most enduring images of the entire war. Sacred loss in Jerusalem had become triumphal display in Rome. This contrast is worth pausing over. In Jerusalem, men and women had fought, starved, fled, prayed, and died. In Rome, those same events were reduced to symbols that flattered power. And Rome was hardly unique in this. Empires often do exactly this. Pain at the frontier becomes prestige at the center. But the Romans did it with extraordinary confidence. And with a sense of theatrical order that still shapes how the episode is remembered. Titus stood at the head of the procession not merely as a successful general, but as the son of the emperor who had completed the war. Vespasian, though not the battlefield commander at the end, remained central as the man whose authority framed the whole campaign. Father and son were now bound together by conquest, by legitimacy, and by the public image of restored order. Simon Bar Giora also had a role to play, but only as a defeated enemy in Roman ritual. He had been kept alive for precisely this moment. In the triumph, he would appear before the Roman people as the conquered leader of Jerusalem's resistance. After the procession, he would be executed in the ritual conclusion of the celebration. That ending was not random cruelty, though cruelty was certainly part of it. It was ceremonial. The death of the defeated commander gave closure to the Roman performance of victory. John of Gischala, by contrast, survived the triumphal drama but spent the rest of his life in imprisonment. It is one of those small historical details that reminds us how uneven the afterlives of defeated leaders can be. Simon was made into a public ending. John was turned into a private remainder. I often think this is where the question of honor becomes hardest to answer. What, in a story like this, counts as honor? Is it the refusal to surrender? Is it the discipline to carry a campaign through to its conclusion? Is it loyalty to one's city, one's faith, one's army, or one's ruler? Simon Bar Giora, John of Gischala, Titus, and Vespasian would each have answered it differently, and each, in some measure, would have believed himself justified. That is one reason history resists simple morality plays. The closer we get to real people, the less comfortable the story becomes. Men can be courageous and destructive at the same time. They can be disciplined and ruthless, faithful and ambitious, determined and self-deluding all at once. Titus could be brave, adaptive, and relentless, and also the agent of immense destruction. Vespasian could be politically gifted and stabilizing for Rome, and also the man whose dynasty was legitimized through catastrophe in Judea. Simon Bar Giora could embody stubborn resistance and command real loyalty, and also be part of the fractured leadership that weakened Jerusalem before its final trial. John of Gischala could be resourceful and tenacious, and also deeply entangled in the rivalries that made unified defense so difficult. History does not let us keep easy categories for long. And perhaps that is why it matters. Not because it gives us clean heroes or villains, but because it forces us to live, for a moment, with complexity. We are made to see how power works, how war narrows choices, how faith can become inseparable from survival, and how ambition can wear the face of necessity. The triumph in Rome made everything look simple. Rome victorious, the East subdued, the gods favorable, the dynasty secure, but beneath that simplicity lay the much harsher reality of Jerusalem: famine, faction, siege works, fires, sacred desecration, captivity, and death. This is one of the things I find most unsettling about the Roman triumph. It was beautiful in form and terrible in implication. The procession was carefully ordered, visually magnificent, and politically effective, yet each object, each captive, each scene on display had been torn from a world of real suffering. Splendor and brutality walked the same route. And still, for the Roman crowd, it would have felt like reassurance. After civil war, uncertainty, and imperial instability, here was visible proof that the empire remained strong. Jerusalem's destruction became part of Rome's own healing narrative. That is another uncomfortable truth of empire. One society's wound can become another society's symbol of recovery. The first Jewish revolt, of course, did not vanish entirely with the triumph. Resistance lingered, most famously at Masada, which would fall only a few years later. But symbolically, Jerusalem had already done the work Rome needed. The city's fall, the temple's destruction, and the triumph in the capital had all combined into one message. The Flavian dynasty had come to power, and it had prevailed. Yet if we step back from the pageant and look again at the ruined city, the message becomes less stable. Victory was real, so was devastation. Legitimacy was strengthened, so was memory of loss. Roman order triumphed in the short term, but the wound left behind in Jewish history would not be erased by Roman ceremony. And perhaps that is the final irony of this stage of the story. Rome believed it had turned Jerusalem into a finished argument, displayed, punished, absorbed into triumph. But history rarely ends so neatly. The memory of what was destroyed often outlives the monuments built by those who destroyed it. In Rome, the triumph gave shape to imperial glory. In Jerusalem, the ruins gave shape to grief. And between those two worlds moved the names we remember now: Vespasian, Titus, Simon bar Giora, John of Gischala, men who made decisions under pressure so severe that victory and ruin became almost impossible to separate. That is why this story still matters. Not because it flatters one side or sanctifies the other, but because it shows what power looks like when it succeeds completely. And what remains afterward for those left to remember.